On the night of October 22nd, 1897, a small group of men gathered in the freezing Chicago dark to bury George Pullman. They worked by lantern light, their breath visible in the autumn air, moving with the careful urgency of people who understood exactly what they were doing and why it had to be done this way. The grave they had prepared was not a grave, it was a fortress. First came the lead-lined casket sealed tight against time and tampering, then a layer of asphalt spread thick and black across the coffin's surface, then railroad ties, T-rails the same kind that had carried his sleeping cars across a continent, laid in a crosshatch pattern over the asphalt, then more asphalt, then concrete poured wet and left to harden into a block the size of a small room. The whole mass sank 8 feet into the earth of Graceland Cemetery, a monument to paranoia disguised as a burial. George Pullman's family had insisted on the precautions, his widow Hattie, his surviving children. They knew what his name had come to mean in the years before his death. They knew that thousands of men who had built his palace cars, who had swept his floors and made his beds and served his passengers, had sworn they would dig him up and scatter his bones across the prairie if they ever got the chance. They knew that the model town he had constructed to prove his theories about the perfectibility of the working class had instead proved something else entirely. Something about the limits of benevolence, the impossibility of gratitude, and the particular fury that rises when a man who controls everything you need decides you should be thankful for the terms on which he provides it. So they buried him in concrete. They buried him beneath a ton of protective weight. They buried him so deep and so permanently that a century later, when archaeologists considered investigating the grave, they calculated it would take heavy construction equipment and several days of work to reach the casket itself. And somewhere in Chicago that night, as the concrete hardened, there were men who had lost their homes and their savings and their faith in the American promise, who heard the news and thought, even now, even in death, he builds walls around himself. The town George Pullman constructed 13 miles south of downtown Chicago still exists. You can drive there today, take the Dan Ryan south, exit at 111th Street, and within minutes you'll find yourself on streets that look almost exactly as they looked in 1881, when the Pullman Palace Car Company first opened for business. The row houses are still standing, the market hall is still standing, the hotel, rechristened the Florence after Pullman's favourite daughter, is still there, its Victorian turret still rising above the surrounding blocks. The factory complex has been repurposed. A portion of it now houses the National A, Philip Randolph Pullman Porter Museum, honouring the black workers who would later organise its sleeping car service, but the bones of Pullman's vision remain intact. Walk those streets, and you can still see what he was trying to build. The houses are handsome, red brick, varied roof lines, bay windows catching the light. The streets are wide and tree-lined. The infrastructure, sewage, gas, water, was decades ahead of what surrounded it. When George Pullman opened this town to the world in 1881, visitors came from across the globe to see the future of industrial relations. They walked the orderly blocks and admired the library and the theatre and the market arcade. They noted the absence of saloons, the presence of churches, the way the company controlled every aspect of life from the style of window curtains to the acceptable varieties of front yard plantings. They called it utopia. They called it an experiment in applied capitalism. They called it proof that a wise owner could shape his workers into better versions of themselves simply by controlling their environment. What none of them could see walking those streets in 1881 or 1885 or 1890 was the pressure building beneath the surface. What none of them understood, though Pullman himself would eventually understand it in the final bitter years of his life, was that a perfect town is not the same as a free one, and that a benevolent dictator is still a dictator, and that human beings who are told they should be grateful for conditions they have no power to change will eventually stop being grateful at all. 13 years after the first residents moved in, the workers of Pullman would rise up against the man who'd given them everything. 13 years after the model town opened its doors, federal troops would be marching through those orderly streets, and workers would be dying in the rail yards, and the strike that began in that little company town would spread across 27 states and paralyze half the nation's railroads and force a president to deploy 12,000 soldiers to restore order. And at the center of all of it, the utopia, the uprising, the intervention, the deaths, and the strange concrete-encased burial that followed, stood a single figure, A man who had risen from nothing, built an empire, and then watched it generate the one thing he could not have anticipated. A man who gave his workers everything except the one thing they actually wanted: control. George Mortimer Pullman was born in 1831 in Brockton, New York, a small town in the western part of the state, to a family of modest means and considerable ambition. His father, James Lewis Pullman, was a mechanic and small contractor who had developed a specialty in moving buildings, literally jacking up houses and barns and relocating them to new foundations. It was unglamorous work, but it paid, and young George learned the trade alongside his father. By the time he was 14, he was working full days. By the time he was 17, his father was dead, and George had taken over the family business. The timing was fortunate. In the 1850s, the Erie Canal was being widened, and the towns along its route needed to move their buildings back from the expanding waterway. George Pullman landed contracts to relocate entire commercial blocks. He developed a reputation for efficiency, for reliability, for getting the job done on budget and on time. By 1859, he had saved enough money to follow the opportunities westward to Chicago. Chicago in 1859 was a city building itself out of mud. The streets were so prone to flooding that residents joked about horses drowning in the thoroughfares. The solution, already underway when Pullman arrived, was to raise the entire city. Literally. Engineers were jacking up whole buildings, sometimes entire blocks, and constructing new foundations beneath them, lifting the urban grid 4 to 7 feet above the marshy ground. Pullman saw the opportunity immediately. Within months, he had contracts to raise buildings along Lake Street, the heart of the commercial district. He raised the Tremont House, the city's finest hotel, while guests continued to check in and out, dine in the restaurant, and sleep in their rooms. 600 men turning 12,000 jackscrews in coordinated sequence, the building rising an inch at a time without a single guest being disturbed. It was a feat of logistics and engineering, and it made Pullman's name. But it was not what made him rich. The sleeping car came to Pullman the way most great ideas come to ambitious men. He saw a problem. He saw that the existing solutions were inadequate, and he believed he could do better. Railroad travel in the 1850s was miserable. The cars were cramped, unheated, poorly ventilated, and offered no accommodation for passengers who needed to sleep on overnight journeys. The sleeping cars that did exist were little more than wooden bunks installed in otherwise standard coaches, uncomfortable, unsanitary, and deeply unpopular with anyone who could afford an alternative. Pullman had travelled enough to experience the misery firsthand, and Pullman understood in a way that his competitors did not, that comfort was a product people would pay for, not just utility, not just transportation, but the experience itself, the feeling of being cared for, attended to, treated as someone of consequence. In 1859, he acquired 2 old passenger coaches from the Chicago and Alton Railroad and began converting them into sleepers. He installed folding upper berths that could be lowered at night. He used better mattresses, finer linens, darker curtains. He paid attention to details his competitors ignored: the quality of the lamplight, the softness of the upholstery, the way air circulated through the car. The first Pullman sleeper entered service in 1859. It was modest by later standards, a converted coach, not a purpose-built car, but passengers noticed the difference immediately. Pullman charged higher fares, and passengers paid them. He had discovered something that would shape the rest of his career. People did not just want to get somewhere, they wanted to feel a certain way while getting there, and they would pay a premium for the feeling. But the real breakthrough came after the Civil War, and it came in the form of a funeral. On April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theatre. He died the following morning, and the nation faced a question. How do you transport the body of a martyred president across a divided country, through city after city, in a way that honours his memory and allows the public to grieve? The answer was a train, a 9-car funeral train that would carry Lincoln's body from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, retracing in reverse the route Lincoln had travelled to his inauguration 4 years earlier. Pullman saw the opportunity. He had spent the war years building his most ambitious sleeping car yet, a car he called the Pioneer. It was wider and taller than any sleeping car in existence, with extravagant woodwork, silver-plated fixtures, French mirrors, and upholstery that cost more per yard than most workers earned in a week. The Pioneer was so large that it couldn't actually fit through existing station platforms or under existing bridges. It was, in a sense, a car without a railroad. But Pullman had built it anyway, confident that if the car was magnificent enough, the railroads would modify their infrastructure to accommodate it. Lincoln's death provided the occasion. Pullman manoeuvred to have the Pioneer included in the funeral train. The Chicago and Alton Railroad, under public pressure to provide the finest possible accommodations for the martyred president, agreed to cut back its station platforms and raise its bridges to allow the Pioneer to pass. By the time Lincoln's body reached Springfield, George Pullman's magnificent sleeping car had been seen by hundreds of thousands of mourning Americans, and more importantly, the infrastructure had been modified to fit it. After that, the other railroads fell in line. If the C&A could accommodate the Pioneer, they could too, and Pullman had not just built a car, he had built a company. The Pullman Palace Car Company was incorporated in 1867, and within a decade it dominated the sleeping car industry. Pullman did not just sell cars to railroads, he retained ownership of them, staffing them with his own employees, porters, conductors, maids, cooks, and collecting fares directly from passengers. The railroads provided the track and the locomotion. Pullman provided the experience. By 1880, the Pullman Palace Car Company operated nearly 700 cars across the nation's railroads. George Pullman was a millionaire many times over. He lived in one of the finest mansions on Prairie Avenue, Chicago's most exclusive address, surrounded by the Armours, the Fields, the Swifts, the men who had made their fortunes in meat and retail and industry, the men who were building the city into the commercial heart of the continent. He had proven that the market would reward beauty, comfort, and attention to detail. He had built an empire on the proposition that the experience of travel could be transformed by thoughtful design. And now he was ready for a larger experiment. The problem, as Pullman saw it in 1879, was that the American worker was degraded by his environment. The tenements of Chicago, of New York, of Pittsburgh, of every industrial city were breeding grounds for vice, disease, and discontent. Workers lived in squalor not because they were inherently slovenly, but because they had no alternative. Give them clean housing, orderly streets, rational amenities, and they would rise to meet their surroundings. Their habits would improve, their productivity would increase, their tendency toward labor agitation, toward strikes and unions and socialistic talk, would diminish as their lives became more comfortable, and their dependency on their employer more total. This was the theory, and George Pullman intended to prove it. He purchased 4,000 acres of open land south of Chicago, along the Illinois Central Railroad line. The location was deliberate, close enough to the city for practical access, far enough away to be isolated from its corrupting influences. He hired a young architect named Solon Spencer Beeman and a landscape designer named Nathan Barrett, and he gave them a commission that had never been attempted in America. Design a complete town. Not just a factory and some worker housing, a town with homes and stores and churches and parks and a hotel and a library and a theatre. A town where every detail reflected the values of its creator. A town where George Pullman's vision of industrial paternalism could be tested in the laboratory of reality. Construction began in 1880. The factory complex came first, a sprawling works that would eventually cover 45 acres, capable of building sleeping cars, dining cars, parlour cars, and every other variety of rolling stock the company required. But the factory was only part of the plan. Around it, Beeman and Barrett laid out residential blocks, following the latest principles of urban design. The streets were wide, the houses were built of dark red brick manufactured on site, with varied facades to prevent the monotony of typical company towns. Each house had indoor plumbing, gas lighting, and a yard. Each block had alleys for service access, keeping delivery wagons and garbage collection out of sight. The landscaping was meticulous. Trees, lawns, flower beds, all maintained by company employees to company standards. At the centre of the town rose the Hotel Florence, named for Pullman's favourite daughter. It was the only building in town where alcohol could be legally purchased, and only in the hotel bar, and only by hotel guests, not by residents of the town itself. Pullman had banned saloons entirely. He had also banned independent newspapers, political meetings, and public speeches not approved by the company. Residents could not own their homes, they could only rent them from the Pullman Company, and the leases could be terminated on 10 days' notice for any reason or no reason at all. The library was stocked with company-approved books. The church, a single non-denominational chapel, was available for rent by any congregation willing to pay the fee, but the fee was set so high that only the most prosperous denominations could afford it, which meant that Catholic workers and immigrant congregations often had to travel into Chicago to worship. Every detail was controlled. The company determined what colours residents could paint their doors. Company inspectors could enter any home at any time to check for cleanliness. Company rules governed where laundry could be hung to dry and what kind of pets could be kept. The streets were named for inventors and capitalists: Pullman, Morse, Watt, Stevenson, Fulton. And the aesthetic was uniformly tasteful, uniformly orderly, uniformly designed to elevate the moral and physical condition of everyone who lived within its borders. The town opened for residents in January 1881. Within a year, more than 8,000 people lived there. Within 3 years, the population exceeded 12,000. Visitors came from across America and Europe to see what Pullman had created. Harper's Weekly sent reporters. The British government sent delegations. The town won an award at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, which was held in Chicago partly because boosters could point to Pullman as evidence of the city's progressive character. The visiting dignitaries saw what they were meant to see: clean streets, healthy children, productive workers, an absence of the poverty and squalor that plagued other industrial districts. They heard what they were meant to hear: that labour troubles were unknown in Pullman, that strikes were unthinkable, that the workers appreciated the blessings their employer had provided. They went home and wrote glowing reports about the possibilities of enlightened capitalism. What they did not see was the pressure beneath the surface. What they did not see was the slow accumulation of resentments that would, within 13 years, shatter everything George Pullman had built. Because there was a catch. There was always a catch. The model town was not a charity. George Pullman had made that clear from the beginning. The Pullman Land Association, which owned every acre and every building in town, was expected to return 6% annually on the investment, the same return Pullman expected from his railroad car business. The rents were set accordingly, competitive with comparable housing in Chicago perhaps, but not with the cheaper accommodations available in other industrial districts. A worker at the Pullman Works paid approximately $14 per month for a 5-room row house, a reasonable sum when wages were steady, a crushing burden when they were not. And wages in the railroad car industry were anything but steady. The American economy of the late 19th century moved in violent cycles: boom and bust, expansion and contraction, years of frenzied growth followed by devastating panics that threw millions out of work. George Pullman had weathered these storms before. He understood that demand for new sleeping cars rose and fell with the fortunes of the railroads themselves. When the economy was strong, the orders poured in. When it faltered, the orders stopped. The depression that began in 1893 was the worst the nation had ever seen. The Reading Railroad failed in February. The National Cordage Company collapsed in May. Banks called in loans, businesses shuttered. Unemployment, which had been negligible a year earlier, soared to nearly 20% nationwide. In some industrial cities, it exceeded 30%. Men who had worked their entire lives found themselves standing in bread lines, or sleeping in public parks, or riding the rails as hobos looking for work that did not exist. The Pullman Palace Car Company was not immune. Orders for new railroad cars plummeted. The company had to cut production, cut hours, cut wages. In the summer of 1893, Pullman announced the first round of layoffs. By the winter of 1893-94, the wage cuts had reached 25 to 40% across the workforce. A worker who had earned $2.50 per day now earned $1.50. A worker who had earned $3 earned $1.80. But here was the catch that had been built into the model town from the very beginning, waiting like a landmine beneath those orderly streets. The rents did not go down. George Pullman refused. The Pullman Land Association was a separate entity from the Pullman Palace Car Company, he explained. The 6% return was a business requirement, not a personal preference. If he lowered rents, he would be violating his fiduciary duty to the shareholders. If he lowered rents, he would be setting a precedent that would undermine the entire economic basis of the model town. If he lowered rents, the workers would never learn to manage their finances responsibly. They would come to expect charity, and charity was corrosive to character. So the workers who had seen their wages cut by a third found themselves still paying the same rent, the same gas bills, the same water charges. Pullman deducted these costs directly from their paychecks, automatically, unavoidably, before the workers ever saw the money. A man might work a full week and receive, after deductions, a paycheck of less than $1. There are surviving records of paychecks for a single penny. A man would labour for 2 weeks and have, at the end of it, a printed receipt for 1 cent, just enough to prove he was still technically employed, not enough to buy a loaf of bread. These were not abstractions. These were families with children. These were men who had moved to Pullman because they believed the promises. These were workers who had given up their independence, their ability to own property, their freedom to live where they chose, their right to associate with whom they pleased, in exchange for the security of a model town that would take care of them. And now the model town was bleeding them dry. The complaints began almost immediately. Delegations of workers approached company management asking for relief, lower rents, restored wages, some acknowledgement that the company had an obligation to the community it had created. Management refused. The delegations approached George Pullman himself. Pullman refused to meet with them. He was in the East, his managers explained, attending to business. He was unavailable. He had nothing to add to what had already been said. In May of 1894, the workers of Pullman joined the American Railway Union. The ARU was new, less than a year old, but it was growing faster than any labour organisation in American history. Its founder and president was Eugene Victor Debs, a former locomotive fireman from Terre Haute, Indiana, who had come to believe that the only way for workers to gain power was to organise not by craft, but by industry. The old unions, the brotherhoods of engineers, of firemen, of switchmen, divided workers against each other, Debs argued. A union that included everyone who worked on the railroads, from the highest paid engineer to the lowest paid track labourer, could bring the entire system to a halt. Debs had proved his point in the spring of 1894, when the ARU had struck against the Great Northern Railway and won. It was the first major victory for industrial unionism in American history, and it electrified working people across the country. In the month that followed, workers flooded into the union, 150,000 members by the summer of 1894, organised into more than 400 local lodges from coast to coast. The Pullman workers formed Local 269. On May 10th, they sent a final delegation to Thomas Wicks, the company's vice president, to present their grievances and ask for negotiation. Wicks refused. He said there was nothing to negotiate. He said the company's position was final. The next morning, 3,000 workers walked off the job. The strike at Pullman, the local strike, the walkout at the factory, was almost irrelevant by itself. The Pullman Palace Car Company could survive a work stoppage at a single plant. It could wait out the strikers, hire replacements, outlast the resistance. What George Pullman did not anticipate, what no one anticipated, was what happened next. The American Railway Union, meeting in Chicago in June of 1894, voted to support the Pullman strikers by refusing to handle any train that included a Pullman car. The boycott began on June 26th. Within days, it had spread across the nation. Rail workers from California to New York refused to couple Pullman cars to trains, refused to move trains that included them, walked off the job when managers tried to force compliance. The railroads, desperate to break the boycott, began attaching Pullman cars to mail trains, deliberately, strategically, to ensure that the refusal to move a Pullman car became a refusal to move the United States mail. That made it a federal crime. President Grover Cleveland, advised by Attorney General Richard Olney, a former railroad attorney with extensive ties to the industry, issued an injunction ordering the strikers back to work. When they refused, he deployed federal troops. On July 3, 1894, nearly 2,000 soldiers entered Chicago. They were not asked for by the governor of Illinois, John Peter Altgeld, who protested that he had the situation under control. They were sent over his explicit objection, on the authority of the president alone, on the grounds that the mail must go through and federal property must be protected. What followed was not a negotiation. It was a military occupation. The soldiers arrived to find the rail yards in chaos. Strikers and sympathizers had gathered by the thousands. Crowds blocked the tracks. Overturned boxcars littered the switching yards. On July 6th, a fire broke out at the World's Columbian Exposition grounds, the same fair that had celebrated Pullman's model town a year earlier, and destroyed 7 buildings. On July 7th, soldiers opened fire on a crowd at the Loomis Street crossing, killing at least 4 people. Over the following days, more clashes, more deaths. The official count was 13 dead in Chicago. The real number was almost certainly higher. Across the country, in the railroad towns where the boycott had spread, the death toll continued to mount. Eugene Debs was arrested on July 17th, charged with contempt of court for violating the injunction. He would serve 6 months in the Woodstock jail in McHenry County, Illinois, and in that jail cell, reading and reflecting on what had happened. He would become a socialist. He would later run for president 5 times on the Socialist Party ticket, receiving nearly 1 million votes in 1912, and he would trace the beginning of his radicalization to the moment when the federal government deployed its army against American workers on behalf of the Pullman Company. The strike collapsed. The boycott collapsed. The workers of Pullman drifted back to the factory in defeat, accepting whatever terms the company offered, returning to the houses they could not afford, the rents they could not pay, the paychecks that would still arrive already depleted by deductions. George Pullman had won. The model town survived. The theory had been tested, and the theory had failed, but the buildings remained, and the factory remained, and the 6% return remained. The workers had learned nothing except their own powerlessness. The owner had learned nothing at all. But something had changed in the way the country thought about places like Pullman. Something had shifted in the public imagination. A presidential commission, appointed to investigate the strike, issued a report that described the town of Pullman as un-American, a place where a private citizen had claimed powers that should belong only to government, where workers had been treated not as citizens but as subjects, where the benevolence of the arrangement had proved to be no benevolence at all, but only a more sophisticated form of control. The commission singled out the rents. It noted that workers had been charged the same amounts during the Depression as during prosperous times. It observed that the company had deducted these charges automatically, leaving families with nothing. It concluded that the Pullman system, whatever its aesthetic achievements, was fundamentally incompatible with the freedoms Americans expected. And the Illinois Supreme Court agreed. In 1898, the court ruled that the Pullman Palace Car Company had exceeded its legal authority. A corporation chartered to manufacture railroad cars had no business owning a town. The company was ordered to divest itself of all property not directly related to its industrial operations. The houses, the stores, the hotel, the theatre, the library, all of it would have to be sold. George Pullman did not live to see the sale completed. He had died a year earlier, on October 19, 1897, of a heart attack at his Prairie Avenue mansion. He was 66 years old. His fortune was estimated at $17.5 million, an immense sum in that era, though not exceptional among the industrial titans of his generation. His family, preparing for the funeral, had immediately begun making arrangements for the unusual burial. They knew what he had meant to the workers who had once lived under his dominion. They knew the hatred his name still inspired in the rail yards and the tenements and the union halls, and so they buried him in concrete. They buried him beneath railroad ties and asphalt and lead. They buried him so deep that no one, not in a century of attempts, has ever been able to reach him. The town he built survives. The houses still stand. The factory has been converted to other uses. The Hotel Florence still rises above the surrounding blocks, its Victorian turret visible from the interstate. You can walk those streets today and see what George Pullman imagined: the orderly vision, the architectural harmony, the proof that environment shapes character and that a wise owner can improve his workers by improving their surroundings. But you cannot see the other thing. You cannot see the paychecks for a penny. You cannot see the families deciding which child would eat today and which would go hungry. You cannot see the moment when a man who has given everything for a promise realizes the promise was never made to him, that he was always the raw material, never the beneficiary of someone else's theory about how the world should work. And you cannot see the grave. You cannot reach it if you tried. In the Graceland Cemetery on the north side of Chicago, beneath a pillar inscribed simply with the name Pullman, there lies a vault that was designed never to be opened. The concrete that surrounds it has hardened for more than a century now. The railroad ties have rusted but held their position. The lead-lined casket within has presumably kept its seal against the corruption of time. George Pullman built his town to prove that a perfect environment could produce perfect workers. He built his grave to protect his body from the workers he had produced. Both structures still stand. Both remain exactly as he designed them. The question of which one tells the truer story about George Pullman, the model town above the ground or the fortress beneath it, is the question his whole career forces us to ask. He gave his workers everything except freedom. He gave them beauty except ownership. He gave them order except voice. And when the system he had created produced not gratitude but fury, he could not understand why. The workers understood why. They had lived inside his experiment. They had watched their wages fall while their rent stayed fixed. They had seen their neighbours evicted for falling behind on payments they could not possibly make. And they had learned, through the long education of the 1894 strike, that the beautiful town was not a gift but a trap, that every amenity came with a price, and the price was always their compliance. The strike itself had begun in May, when the Pullman Palace Car Company announced another round of wage cuts. This was the 5th reduction in 8 months. Skilled mechanics who had once earned $4 a day now brought home less than $2. Seamstresses in the upholstery department, women who stitched the velvet interiors of the sleeping cars, found their piecework rates slashed until they were making pennies per hour. And through all of it, through every reduction, every layoff, every speed up of the assembly line, the rents in Pullman had not moved. The water charges had not moved. The gas bills had not moved. The company stores still charge prices 10 to 15% higher than the shops in Chicago, and workers were still expected to buy from them. Thomas Heathcote was a car builder. He had come to Pullman in 1886, drawn by the promise of steady work and a decent house in a town without saloons. By 1894, he had a wife and 4 children. His rent was $18 a month for a 5-room house on Watt Avenue. His wages, after the cuts, came to approximately $30 a month when there was work. But the Depression had slowed orders, and the company was running 3-day weeks. Some pay periods, Heathcote brought home less than $12. The rent was deducted before he ever saw the money. He received a pay envelope with a slip inside. Wages earned minus rent owed minus water charges minus gas. Sometimes the slip showed a balance of $2 or $3. Sometimes it showed nothing at all. Sometimes it showed that he owed the company money, that his labour that week had not covered the cost of living in George Pullman's town. Jenny Curtis was a seamstress. She had worked in the Pullman shop since she was 17. Her father had died while employed by the company, and the funeral expenses had been advanced by the Pullman Loan Office to be repaid through deductions from Jenny's wages. By the spring of 1894, she had been repaying that loan for more than 2 years. Her wages had been cut 3 times. She owed the company more than she would earn in 6 months, and she could not leave. To leave Pullman was to forfeit employment. To forfeit employment was to default on the debt. To default on the debt was to lose everything her father had worked for, everything her mother still clung to. So Jenny Curtis stayed. She stitched velvet cushions for the sleeping cars of wealthy passengers, and each week her pay envelope showed her falling further behind on a debt that could not be escaped. These were the people who walked off the job on May 11th, 1894. Not radicals, not professional agitators. Workers, men and women who had believed in the Pullman promise and discovered that the promise meant nothing when the economy turned. They did not strike for higher wages. They did not strike for shorter hours. They struck for a reduction in rent, a recognition that if the company could cut wages by 1/3, it should cut housing costs as well. They were asking for the logic of the market to be applied consistently, not just in the direction that benefited George Pullman. The company refused to negotiate. George Pullman himself refused even to meet with the workers' representatives. He declared that there was nothing to negotiate, that the wages paid were the wages the market would bear, and that the rents charged were the rents the properties were worth, and that the two had nothing to do with each other. He was a landlord in Pullman, he explained, and he was an employer in Pullman, and the fact that his tenants and his employees were the same people was a coincidence of geography, not a relationship that imposed any obligation. The workers turned to Eugene Debs. Debs was 39 years old in 1894, the president of the American Railway Union, a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes and a voice that carried across rail yards and meeting halls with the rhythms of a tent revival preacher. He had organised the ARU just a year earlier, building it into the largest labour union in the country. More than 150,000 members by some counts, brakemen and engineers and switchmen and firemen from every major railroad in America. Debs did not want a confrontation with Pullman. He knew the risks. He advised the Pullman workers to be patient, to build support, to wait for a more favourable moment. But the workers were already starving. Their families were already being evicted. They sent delegation after delegation to ARU headquarters in Chicago, begging for help. And finally, at the union's national convention in June, Debs put the question to a vote. The delegates voted to boycott Pullman cars. Beginning June 26, 1894, no member of the American Railway Union would handle any train that included a Pullman sleeping car. They would not switch them onto sidings. They would not attach them to locomotives. They would not couple them to other cars. If the railroads wanted to keep running, they would have to detach the Pullman cars first. The railroads refused. What happened next was the largest labour action in American history to that point. Within a week, more than 125,000 workers had walked off the job. Rail traffic west of Chicago came to a near-complete halt. Trains sat motionless in switching yards from Illinois to California. Mail cars piled up on sidings. Livestock shipments rotted. Grain elevators overflowed. The entire transportation network of the nation's western half simply stopped because workers refused to move trains that carried the sleeping cars of one company. George Pullman watched this from his Prairie Avenue mansion. He made no public statements. He issued no appeals for compromise. He simply waited for the government to act on his behalf. He knew it would. He had spent 30 years cultivating relationships with the men who ran the railroads and the men who ran the country. He served on boards with them. He dined with them. He had once hosted President Grover Cleveland at his home, and he understood, as clearly as any man of his generation, that in a conflict between capital and labour, the government would ultimately choose capital. The General Managers Association made the first move. This was a consortium of 24 railroads operating in and out of Chicago, effectively a cartel that controlled nearly all freight and passenger traffic in the region. The managers met on June 25th, the day before the boycott began, and agreed to present a unified front. No railroad would detach Pullman cars. No railroad would recognise the ARU. Any worker who refused to handle a Pullman car would be immediately dismissed and blacklisted from employment on any other line. The individual railroads had been struggling to maintain discipline among their workers, but acting together, they could starve the strikers into submission. The managers also sent a request to the federal government. They asked for troops. The legal basis for military intervention was slender. The Constitution gives the president power to suppress insurrection and to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. But there was no insurrection in Chicago, only a strike. There was no defiance of federal law, only a refusal to work. The workers were not attacking the government. They were simply withholding their labour until their grievances were addressed. This had never before been considered grounds for military force. But the General Managers Association had an ally in Washington. His name was Richard Olney. Olney was the Attorney General of the United States, the Chief Legal Officer of the Cleveland administration. He was also, before his appointment, a railroad lawyer. He had served on the boards of several railroads. He held stock in several more, and he remained, even while serving as Attorney General, a paid director of a railroad company that was affected by the strike. This conflict of interest would be disqualifying today. In 1894, it was simply how business was conducted. Olney devised a strategy. If the strike could not be broken as a labour dispute, it could be broken as a criminal conspiracy. The railroads carried the United States mail. Any interference with rail traffic was therefore interference with the mail, a federal crime. Olney obtained an injunction from a federal court ordering the workers to cease their boycott and return to work. The injunction was sweeping. It prohibited not just violence or sabotage, but any action that might interfere with rail operations, including peacefully refusing to work, including speaking to other workers about the strike, including virtually any form of collective action. It was in effect a court order making the strike itself illegal, and then Olney asked for troops to enforce it. President Cleveland hesitated. Governor John Peter Altgeld of Illinois, a Democrat like Cleveland, had objected strenuously. Altgeld insisted that there was no disorder in Chicago that state militia could not handle. He pointed out that the Constitution requires a state legislature or governor to request federal troops before they can be deployed to suppress domestic violence. No such request had been made. The governor of Illinois was telling the President of the United States that federal troops were not wanted and not needed. Cleveland sent them anyway. On July 4th, 1894, Independence Day. The first federal soldiers arrived in Chicago. They came from Fort Sheridan, north of the city, a garrison that had been built specifically to provide rapid military response to labor unrest. By the end of the week, there were 2,000 regular army troops in the city, supplemented by 5,000 state militia and 3,000 deputy marshals hastily sworn in by federal authorities. The marshals were paid by the railroads. Many of them were strikebreakers or railroad security men given temporary federal badges. They reported to the government, but took orders from the General Managers Association. The violence began almost immediately. On July 5th, crowds gathered along the rail lines on the south side near the Pullman factory itself. They were not all strikers. Some were unemployed men caught up in the general chaos of the Depression. Some were teenagers looking for excitement. Some were neighborhood residents who simply hated the railroads and saw an opportunity to express that hatred. The crowd began overturning boxcars. They set fire to freight that had been left on the tracks. A pall of smoke rose over the city. Newspaper reporters wrote of anarchy and revolution. The headlines screamed of mobs and conflagration, and then the soldiers began to fire. The first deaths came on July 6th, in a confrontation near the Grand Crossing rail yard. Soldiers had been deployed to prevent crowds from blocking the tracks. Someone in the crowd threw a rock. Someone else threw a bottle. A nervous lieutenant ordered his men to fire. 4 people died. At least 20 were wounded. None of the dead had been armed. One was a woman who had been watching from her front porch. The following day, July 7th, a larger confrontation erupted near the Panhandle Railroad tracks on 49th Street. A crowd estimated at 10,000 had gathered. Strikers, their families, sympathizers from neighboring communities, the simply curious. Federal marshals and state militia were attempting to clear the track so a mail train could pass. The crowd refused to disperse. Someone threw something. Accounts differ on what. The troops opened fire. The death toll from that afternoon has never been precisely established. Official figures listed 4 killed. Newspaper accounts reported more than a dozen. Witnesses claimed bodies were carried away by family members who feared reprisals for identifying their dead. What is certain is that dozens were wounded, that the crowd broke and fled, and that the rail lines were cleared by force of arms. The mail train passed through the empty streets, past the blood on the cobblestones, on its way to the Pacific coast. In the aftermath, the authorities began making arrests. Eugene Debs was taken into custody on July 10th, charged with contempt of court for violating the federal injunction and with conspiracy to obstruct the mail. He would spend 6 months in the McHenry County Jail, reading and writing and emerging with a political philosophy far more radical than the one he had held when he went in. The strike had made him a moderate trade unionist. The prison would make him a socialist. Hundreds of other workers were arrested. Many were held without bail. Some were beaten by police or by the hired deputies of the railroad companies. Almost none were ever convicted of any crime. The charges were too vague, the evidence too thin, the juries too sympathetic. But conviction had never been the point. The point was to break the strike. And by mid-July, the strike was broken. The trains began to run again. The workers who had walked off the job discovered that their positions had been filled. The railroads had hired replacement workers, scabs, in the language of the labour movement, and those workers now held the jobs that the strikers had abandoned. The ARU members who tried to return found themselves blacklisted. Their names circulated among railroad companies throughout the country. Some never worked in the rail industry again. They drifted to other jobs, other cities, other lives. The great union that Eugene Debs had built collapsed within months. By the end of 1894, the American Railway Union had effectively ceased to exist. And in Pullman, the company tightened its grip. The workers who had led the strike were evicted. Their families were given days to vacate the company houses. Their names were added to lists that were shared among employers throughout the Chicago Industrial District. These men had defied George Pullman. They would not work in Chicago again. The workers who remained, those who had not joined the strike, or who had returned to work quickly enough to escape punishment, found themselves living under even closer surveillance. Foremen monitored not just their productivity but their conversations, their associations, their attitudes. Any hint of union sympathy meant dismissal. The company wanted docility, and it meant to have it. But something had changed. The federal commission that investigated the strike, the commission that would eventually contribute to the court ruling against the company, had done more than document the failures of the Pullman system. It had publicised them. Newspapers across the country reprinted the testimony of workers like Thomas Heathcote and Jenny Curtis. Readers who had never heard of Pullman, Illinois now knew about the paychecks for a penny. They knew about the rents that did not fall when wages fell. They knew about the evictions, the surveillance, the utter dependence that George Pullman had engineered into the lives of his employees. And they were appalled. The model town that had once drawn admiring visitors from around the world was now an object of national criticism. Editorial writers who had praised Pullman's paternalism now denounced it as feudalism. Ministers who had celebrated the wholesome community now preached sermons about the arrogance of wealth. Even business leaders, men who shared Pullman's assumptions about labour and capital, began to distance themselves from his methods. The violence in Chicago had reminded everyone what industrial conflict could cost. No one wanted to provoke another confrontation. The Pullman model, which had seemed so promising, now looked like a blueprint for disaster. George Pullman retreated. He made fewer public appearances. He spent more time at his Prairie Avenue mansion and less time at the factory that bore his name. He had won the strike. His workers had returned to their jobs. His train still ran on every major line in the country. But he had lost something that could not be recovered. The belief that his system was righteous, that his methods were sound, that history would vindicate his vision of an ordered, hierarchical, perfectly designed society. He died 3 years later, on an October morning in 1897. The heart attack came without warning. He had been in apparently good health, dining with friends, conducting business, living the life of a wealthy industrialist in the final years of the Gilded Age, and then he was gone. His family knew what to do. They had discussed this. They had planned for it. In the hours after his death, while the newspapers were still printing their first editions, the Pullman family contacted a construction firm. They ordered the excavation to begin immediately. They wanted a pit large enough to hold a vault 8 feet deep. They wanted it lined with lead. They wanted railroad ties placed across the top, and concrete poured over the ties, and more concrete poured over that. They wanted their father buried so deep that no human hand could ever reach him. The workers, they knew, had not forgotten. The strike had been 3 years ago, but the hatred was fresh. Men who had been evicted from company housing still lived in Chicago. Men who had been blacklisted still gathered in union halls. Men who had watched their friends shot down by federal troops still walked the streets where the blood had been washed away. These men knew where George Pullman would be buried, and the Pullman family understood that some of them might try to reach the body. There had been precedents. In the bitter strikes of the 1870s and 1880s, graves had been vandalised, bodies had been exhumed and mutilated, coffins had been dragged through the streets as symbols of working-class revenge. The Pullman family had no intention of allowing their patriarch to suffer such indignities. They would bury him beyond the reach of any mob. The funeral was held at the Pullman mansion on Prairie Avenue. 200 guests attended. Business associates, society figures, men who had served with Pullman on corporate boards and government commissions. The Reverend James Vila Blake, pastor of the Third Unitarian Church, delivered the eulogy. He spoke of George Pullman's vision, his industry, his contributions to American transportation. He did not speak of the strike. He did not speak of the workers who had starved in company houses while paying company rents. He did not speak of the soldiers who had fired into the crowds, or the bodies that had been carried away from the rail yards, or the families that had been evicted into the Chicago winter. These things were not mentioned in the Pullman mansion on the day of George Pullman's funeral. The burial took place at Graceland Cemetery, on the north side of the city, far from the factory and the model town. The pit had been prepared according to specifications. The lead-lined casket was lowered into the vault. The railroad ties were placed across the opening. The concrete was poured. It took hours to set. The workmen smoothed the surface and cleaned their tools and left. Above the vault, a simple pillar was erected, inscribed with nothing but the name, Pullman. It stands there still. The town he had built did not die with him. It could not. Too many people still lived there, still worked there, still paid rent to the company that now operated without its founder. But something had changed. The certainty was gone. The grand experiment, the model community that was supposed to prove the superiority of benevolent capitalism over the chaos of democracy, now existed in a kind of legal limbo. Because even as George Pullman was being lowered into his fortress of lead and concrete, The courts were deciding what would become of his creation. The case had been working its way through the Illinois judicial system since before his death. The state's attorney general had filed suit against the Pullman Palace Car Company in 1894, just months after the strike ended. The argument was simple. The company had been chartered to manufacture sleeping cars. It had not been chartered to operate a municipality. It had no legal authority to own houses, to collect rents, to run a water system, to maintain streets, to operate a hotel, to control every aspect of civic life for 12,000 residents. The company had exceeded its charter. The town was illegal. The Pullman Company fought the suit with every resource at its disposal. Its lawyers argued that the town was essential to the business, that workers needed housing, that housing required infrastructure, that infrastructure required management. They argued that the company had invested millions of dollars in the town and could not simply abandon its investment. They argued that the workers themselves benefited from the arrangement, that Pullman offered amenities unavailable in other industrial districts, that the alternative was the chaos of back of the yards or packing town. The courts were not persuaded. In 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled against the Pullman Palace Car Company. The decision was unambiguous. The company had no authority to own a town. It had no authority to collect rents. It had no authority to govern. The court ordered the company to divest itself of all property not directly related to the manufacture and operation of sleeping cars. Every house, every store, every church, every blade of grass in every manicured lawn. All of it had to go. The company was given 5 years to comply. What followed was the dismantling of a utopia. The Pullman Company began selling off its holdings piece by piece. The houses went first. Workers who had spent years paying rent suddenly had the opportunity to buy the homes they lived in. Some did. Others could not afford the prices the company demanded. Others had no interest in owning property in a town that had tried to control their every movement, their every association, their every thought. They left. They found housing elsewhere in Chicago, in neighborhoods where the landlord did not also sign their paychecks, where the grocer did not report their purchases to the company, where they could drink a beer without violating the terms of their lease. The arcade, the great commercial center that had been the jewel of Pullman's design, was sold. The Hotel Florence, named for Pullman's favorite daughter, was sold. The Greenstone Church, with its serpentine stone walls and its organ that Pullman himself had donated, was sold to the congregation that had worshipped there for nearly 2 decades. The library was sold, the theatre was sold, the athletic grounds were sold. One by one, the institutions that had made Pullman a model town passed into other hands. The water tower remained. The company kept it because it served the factory, and the factory was the only thing the company had ever been legally entitled to own. But the tower no longer presided over a kingdom. It presided over a neighborhood, just another neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, indistinguishable from dozens of others except for the unusual uniformity of its architecture. By 1907, the divestiture was complete. The Pullman Palace Car Company owned nothing in Pullman except its factory. The workers who remained were no longer tenants, they were homeowners, or they rented from private landlords who had purchased the properties from the company. They shopped at stores owned by independent merchants. They worshipped at a church that answered to no industrial power. They drank finally in saloons that the company could not close. The model town was over, but the factory endured. The Pullman Palace Car Company continued to manufacture sleeping cars in the great brick buildings along the rail yards. It continued to employ thousands of workers. It continued to dominate the industry it had created. George Pullman's cars still carried passengers on every major railroad in America, and his company still maintained an effective monopoly on luxury rail travel. The strike had not broken the business. It had only broken the idea that business could be something more than business, that a corporation could be a civilization, that an employer could be a government, that profit and paternalism could somehow be made to align. The workers who remained at the factory had learned something from the strike. They had learned that they could not win alone. The ARU had collapsed because it had tried to fight a national battle without national support. The other railroad brotherhoods had refused to join. The AFL had offered sympathy but no soldiers. The government had sided with capital. The workers had been isolated, surrounded, starved into submission. They would not make that mistake again. In the years after the strike, the men who worked in the Pullman factory began organizing with a different strategy. They did not try to build one big union. They did not try to strike against the entire railroad industry at once. They organized shop by shop, trade by trade, building strength slowly, carefully, learning from the failure of 1894. It would take decades. It would take another generation. But eventually the workers at the Pullman Company would win recognition, would win contracts, would win the right to bargain collectively that George Pullman had denied them. Eugene Debs never worked for a railroad again. The 6 months he spent in the Woodstock jail transformed him. He entered the prison a union leader, a man who believed that the interests of labour and capital could be reconciled through organisation and negotiation. He left the prison a socialist, a man who believed that the interests of labour and capital were fundamentally opposed, that the system itself was the enemy, that no reform could make capitalism just. He read voraciously during his imprisonment Marx, Kautsky, Bellamy, the theorists of a new economic order. When he emerged, he was a different man with a different mission. Debs ran for president 5 times on the Socialist Party ticket. In 1912, he won nearly 1 million votes, 6% of the total, the highest percentage any socialist candidate has ever received in an American presidential election. He ran again in 1920, from a prison cell in Atlanta, where he was serving a sentence for opposing American entry into the First World War. He won nearly 1 million votes again. He was pardoned by Warren Harding in 1921 and returned to his home in Terre Haute, where he died 5 years later. At his funeral, thousands gathered in the streets. They came from across the country. Union organisers, socialist activists, ordinary workers who had never met him but who felt that he had spoken for them. They carried signs and banners and photographs. They wept openly. They sang labour songs in languages from half the nations of Europe, and they buried him in a grave that required no lead lining, no concrete vault, no railroad ties to hold back the vengeful dead. Eugene Debs was not afraid of the workers. He was one of them. He had always been one of them, and they had never wanted anything from him but his voice. The town of Pullman did not disappear after the company sold off its holdings. The houses remained, the factories remained. The water tower with its distinctive brickwork remained, rising over the flat prairie south of Chicago like a monument to a vanished ambition. People continued to live there, continued to work there, continued to raise children in the houses that George Pullman had designed for families that did not yet exist. The street names did not change. The grid pattern did not change. The Romanesque facades and the Queen Anne details and the careful gradations of house size from executive row to common labourer's cottage. None of these things changed. Pullman endured as a physical fact long after it ceased to exist as an idea. But the meaning of the place shifted. What had been a company town became simply a town. What had been a controlled environment became an ordinary neighbourhood. What had been a utopia became a curiosity, a place that architectural historians visited to study the integration of industrial and residential design, that urban planners examined as an example of comprehensive community development, that labour historians walked through with students, pointing out the factory gates where the strikers had gathered, the rows of houses where the evictions had taken place, the spot where the federal troops had formed their lines. By the middle of the 20th century, Pullman had become something George Pullman never anticipated. It had become a historic site. It had become a place that people preserved not because they agreed with what it represented, but because they understood that what it represented was important to remember. The houses were landmarked, the factory buildings were protected, the Hotel Florence was restored and opened as a museum. Walking tours were offered on weekend afternoons, led by guides who explained the history of the model town, the philosophy behind its design, the strike that had destroyed its founding vision. The water tower became the symbol of the neighbourhood, its image reproduced on historical markers, on tourism brochures, on the signs that marked the boundaries of the Pullman Historic District. It was photographed more than any other structure in the old company town. Visitors stood beneath it and looked up at the brick and stone, at the windows and battlements that George Pullman had commissioned to demonstrate the permanence and dignity of his industrial empire. They did not see what Pullman had seen. They did not see order and hierarchy and the proper arrangement of social classes. They saw an artifact. They saw a relic of another century's beliefs about work and wealth, and the relationship between those who labour and those who profit from that labour. In 2015, President Barack Obama designated Pullman a national monument, the first such designation in the history of Chicago. The ceremony was held on the grounds of the old factory. The president spoke of labour history, of the workers who had struggled for dignity and fair wages, of the long arc of progress that had bent toward justice. He did not speak of George Pullman as a villain. He spoke of him as a man of his time, a man who believed that he was doing good, a man who had built something real and lasting and complicated. The monument preserves not just the buildings but the story. The strike is told. The deaths are counted. The federal intervention is explained. The workers are named and remembered, not just Debs, who became famous, but the thousands of ordinary men and women who risked everything they had for the chance to bargain as equals with the company that controlled their lives. Their names are inscribed on walls and printed in pamphlets. Their descendants sometimes visit, looking for traces of great-grandparents who lived in company houses and walked to work in company factories and stood in the streets when the soldiers came. The graves are still there too. George Pullman lies beneath his fortress at Graceland Cemetery, the concrete and lead still intact after more than a century. The railroad ties presumably still in place, though no one has ever excavated to check. His grave has never been disturbed. No mob has ever attempted to reach his body. The workers' hatred died with the workers, and their children had other concerns and their grandchildren barely remembered. And now the only people who visit the grave are tourists and historians who photograph the simple column with its single word and wonder, what kind of man inspires his family to bury him like a pharaoh? Eugene Debs lies in Terre Haute, in the cemetery where his family had been buried for generations. His grave is modest, a headstone, a plot, nothing to distinguish it from any other working-class burial in any other Indiana town. But people still visit. They leave flowers, they leave Union pins, they leave handwritten notes thanking him for his work, for his voice, for the 5 presidential campaigns that had no chance of winning, but that said something important about what America might become. The contrast between the two graves tells you everything you need to know about what the strike of 1894 meant, and who understood that meaning first. The Pullman cars themselves lasted longer than anyone expected. The company continued manufacturing them into the 1980s, nearly a century after George Pullman's death. The name remained on the sleeping cars long after the company had passed through multiple owners, long after the founder's vision had been forgotten by everyone except archivists and academics. Travellers who had never heard of the strike, who had never heard of the model town, who knew nothing of the man or his methods, still slept in beds that bore his name, still asked conductors for Pullman service, still associated the brand with luxury and comfort and the golden age of American rail travel. The last Pullman car was retired in the 1990s. By then, the sleeper business had long since passed to Amtrak, and Amtrak had long since stopped pretending that train travel was luxurious. The cars that George Pullman had designed to be rolling palaces had become relics, preserved in railroad museums or rusting in yards where enthusiasts gathered to mourn the end of an era. A few remain in operation on heritage lines, carrying tourists through mountain passes and across prairies on journeys designed to evoke the romance of 19th century travel. The porters are gone. The pressed white jackets are gone. The elaborate service rituals that Pullman had codified are gone. What remains is a memory, a brand, a word that still means something to people old enough to remember what train travel used to be. But in Chicago, in the neighborhood that still bears his name, George Pullman's monument stands in a different form. Not the water tower, which is only architecture, not the houses, which are only real estate, not the factory, which produced cars but never produced the social transformation he promised. His real monument is the contradiction he created and could never resolve, the belief that order could be imposed without consent, that happiness could be engineered without freedom, that a company could be a community and a boss could be a father, and workers would accept their place in a hierarchy designed for someone else's benefit. He built a perfect town. He controlled every detail. He believed that environment determined character, that rational design would produce rational behavior, that workers living in beautiful houses and walking down tree-lined streets would naturally become the kind of workers he wanted. Grateful, obedient, industrious, content. He believed that if he gave them everything except autonomy, they would never notice what was missing. He was wrong. The strike of 1894 proved that workers notice. They notice when they cannot choose where to shop. They notice when they cannot gather without permission. They notice when they cannot vote on the rules that govern their lives. They notice when their wages are cut but their rents stay the same. They notice when the man who signs their paychecks also collects their payments, controls their water, inspects their homes, and monitors their associations. They notice when they are treated as children in a company that calls itself a family, and eventually, inevitably, they refuse. George Pullman never understood why his workers refused. He never understood why they turned on the man who had given them so much. He died believing that he had been betrayed by ingratitude, that his workers had rejected not just his wages but his entire vision of what industrial society could become. He was buried in a vault designed to protect his body from the revenge of men he had tried to uplift. But the revenge never came. The workers had won something larger than the satisfaction of desecrating a corpse. They had won the argument. They had proven that paternalism is not benevolence. They had proven that control is not care. They had proven that a perfect town designed without the consent of its residents is not a utopia but a prison, and that workers who are told they should be grateful will eventually ask what exactly they should be grateful for. The model town is a museum now. The factory produces nothing. The water tower watches over houses that are owned by the people who live in them, and George Pullman lies undisturbed beneath his lead and concrete, protected from a vengeance that no one remembers wanting to take. The company sold the town because the courts ordered it to. The workers bought the houses because they could finally afford to. The neighborhood survived because neighborhoods do, because people need places to live and streets to walk and buildings to shelter their ordinary lives. But the idea that George Pullman tried to prove, the idea that benevolent capitalism could engineer human contentment, the idea that workers would accept supervision in exchange for cleanliness and order and the illusion of security, that idea lies buried too, in a grave that requires no concrete to keep it down. It has not risen yet. Outside the gates of the old Pullman factory there is a plaque that tells visitors what happened here. It mentions the cars, it mentions the strike, it mentions the deaths, but it does not draw a moral. It does not tell you what to think. It presents the facts and leaves you standing in the street where the workers stood, looking at the buildings where the workers worked, imagining what it might have felt like to live in a town designed by your employer for his benefit and yours, where every convenience was provided and only one thing was forbidden: the right to say no. The trains still pass through on the tracks that run beside the old factory. They are freight trains now, mostly, carrying goods that have nothing to do with George Pullman or his palace cars. The engineers do not slow down. The conductors do not point. There is nothing to see from a moving train except brick buildings and a water tower and a neighborhood that looks like any other neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. But if you stand on the platform where the workers once waited for their shifts to begin, if you look north toward the skyline and south toward the open prairie, if you listen to the wind moving through streets that have not changed their names in 140 years, you can still feel the weight of the question that George Pullman asked and never answered. What do you owe the people who work for you? How much of their lives can you claim? Where does employment end and servitude begin? He built a town to answer those questions his way. The town still stands, but his answers are gone now, buried under decades of law and negotiation, and the slow recognition that workers are not children, and employers are not fathers, and a paycheck is not the same as a debt. The water tower watches, the houses line their quiet streets, and somewhere in the cemetery on the north side, under 8 feet of lead and concrete and rusting railroad ties, George Pullman sleeps the sleep he designed for himself, protected from his workers, unreachable, alone.